No, I stay on mute because I have lots of antics, and some of you don't need to hear all that. Yeah. Just a little bit about me, and I do have some slides and that kind of stuff. I just want to go over because it helps me stay focused. But I really want this to be a conversation about how we're dealing with this stuff. But I also want to give some information so that we have a good way or some tools to talk about this. So I am so my name is Andre Koen, and I'm from the Midwest. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio. I don't know if folks know where Dayton is, but it's now part of the Rust Belt. From Pennsylvania all the way to Illinois. We're all part of what used to be manufacturing stuff, and so very very basic people, very simple people. And when I say that, I'm not saying intellectually, but I'm saying in terms of the things that drive them. And so my parents met in high school. Um, and they knew each other in elementary school and junior high school in small communities. That kind of happens, right? And so they got married in their sophomore year in college, which if you can imagine, in the '70s getting married as a sophomore, they didn't have a lot of uh, their education wasn't secure enough to actually give them a leg up. So this idea of being a young married couple was kind of a challenge for my parents. And then soon after that, I was born. So there's a joke, and I don't mention it around my parents. So my dad is also a pastor, and I'll talk about that in just a second. And so when I was growing up, it was always, no sex before marriage and that kind of stuff. But when I was in middle school, I started adding up the fact that my parents were married in June, but I was born in October. And the math doesn't quite work for so but we don't talk about that. We just pretend like but interestingly enough, I so my dad, his senior year in high school, witnessed the assassination of Dr. King and wanted to do something about it. And so he graduates from high school. He talks to my grandfather about wanting to, do something about King's death and assassination. And my grandfather says, "Great, do it someplace else." My grandfather wasn't one of those guys that was a troublemaker. He was like, "Keep your head down, do good, and good will come to you." And my dad was in that generation where he was like, "No, we got to make good happen." And so my dad went off to college and became a Black Panther. And um, and then he met my mom. I mean, he married my mom, and soon I was born. And then he realized that the revolution was a bad place to raise a family. And he also got a call from God, and God, called my dad to be a Pentecostal fire and brimstone preacher, and so that was my life. And so growing up, I had the best of two worlds. One was this notion of civic responsibility and local community action from the Panther side of my dad's life, as well as looking at the interconnectedness that we can get from having a spiritual relationship, not only with the other, vertically, but also with our neighbors, right? So having those spiritual connectedness in community, as well as relationship with God, having social responsibility, as well, so that was the bastion in which I was grown up in. So in my presentation, if it feels like I'm preaching, it's not my fault. I I was raised by a preacher, and if it feels like I'm getting a little political, I am, because my political affiliation is with the Constitution of the United States. So that's a little bit about me. And so I'd like to know just a little bit about each of you. If you could just give a sentence or two about who you are and what you do in the organization, that would be great. Okay. Okay. Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. That's cool. Oh, Sister Edwards, go ahead. Just give me a sentence or two about yourself. You started from the bottom and now you're at the top. All right. Go ahead, Jeff. Wow. Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. Mm, wonderful. Cool. Wonderful. Wonderful. I've been trying to keep track. I want to make sure everyone has an opportunity.
my cubicle, I have a sticky note that just says restorative justice.
Mm.
I kind of regret not bringing it home with me, but here we are. I'm working from home. I have a fun little background that's a snapshot from a video game, so you don't see my bedroom behind me. I live with my in-laws. I've been married for about a year. I've been married for about a year and a half. I actually got married about 3 days before I started adversity. Not my childhood sweetheart, but we did meet at my first job. And I think we were together for about 7 years before we got married. So I live with my in-laws. We have dogs. I love my dogs so much. Thanks for being here.
Yeah.
Lauren?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Lauren. I'm the supervisor for the organ recovery team for the organ procurement organization in Wisconsin. So my team is the team that really facilitates the recovery of organs that then get sent out for transplant. So my team really deals with death and dying on a daily basis. And as we all know, everybody from every shape, color, size, background can be an organ donor, and at the same time could be in need of an organ transplant at some point in their lives. So my team, in conjunction with the tissue bank that's also in Wisconsin, is working to kind of help facilitate saving those people's lives and getting them back to, on the tissue side, getting them back to living the life that they deserve.
Wonderful.
And then Janice or Alan? I didn't know if they might have walked away.
My name's Alan Mast. I'm a senior investigator at the Blood Research Institute University. I've worked here for a long time, so I'm a scientist.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
All right, now, and I guess this is Janice Snye, the HR business partner in Michigan, and I've been at Versity for 3 years in the human resources and part of the D&I team working mostly focused on the inclusion and making our, helping the current employees feel the inclusion side and just trying to make everything on that side of it work well. So it sounds like we have a lot of people with the medicine pieces of it, where I'm more of the employee focused piece of it that way.
Well, I want to say I appreciate all of you, and thank you so much for being vulnerable. And Michelle, you didn't get a chance.
I was okay with that. So I'm Michelle Waite. I've been a part of diversity and inclusion, I guess now counting, for the last 11 years. I led the effort for about 9 years when I was at Harley Davidson, and then coming over here. I've been supporting this effort for the last, I don't know, 7 months or so. So it's fun, and now I'm starting to do it more officially as I'm also over our multicultural outreach team as well, and I'm humbled and thankful that I can be able to do this work.
Cool. So before we go any further, there are a couple of things I need to. I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize these things. So, first of all of us, when we wake up in the morning, we have to recognize a few things. One is that the land that we're standing on comes from Native Americans, right? So we have to understand that as a context, that every morning that we wake up, the conquered people that originally held this land were American Indians. So that's important. What else is important to recognize is that we all have privilege and power. That we all have privilege and power, right? So when I think about my own self, I'm 6'2". I'm African American. I don't have a felony. I have matriculated through higher education. I am mildly attractive and extremely humble, right?
That's very funny.
So some of those privileges I can access that actually give me power. And power we'll define as the ability to get things done, right? So I can use some of my privileges to access power. Some of those privileges I was born with, and others of those privileges I acquired myself. And so again, we would be remiss if we did not recognize our own privilege and power, because if we don't recognize that, then it can become a weapon for and towards other people. So I recognize the fact that being a heterosexual male or I present as a kind of stereotypical cisgendered heterosexual male who has the ability to get married. So we recognize that that doesn't happen in the States, that people have that as a resource. So I have to be mindful of my own privilege and power so that I don't say, well, why aren't you talking about your family the way I talk about my family? Maybe they can't, they're not in a situation where they can do that, right? And also recognizing that I can't use my worldview as the worldview to measure everything else, that I have to set my worldview alongside of others' worldviews. And we'll talk a little bit about that once we get into the presentation. So I do want us to recognize that we all have privilege and power. And it's not so much having it that should concern us as much as what do we do with that privilege and power, right? And so I want you to think about in what ways do you have privilege, in what ways do you have power, and then how do you use that? And we'll talk a little bit later. We'll get into some more conversation opportunities around those thoughts. And so right now, I'm just wondering, can you see my slide on the screen? Okay, great. So I'm going to advance that. I'm also going to turn on the closed captions, which you'll see at the bottom of the screen, hopefully. In case the audio cuts out or whatever, you can still follow along with words. And I did ask Michelle if she could preserve this part of the conversation for me so that I can learn more about how well I did in this presentation and reflect on it. So I did ask her to do that on my behalf. So let me just go into my slide deck really quick. I'm going to minimize our chat room. And there's three of us that have been working on this project with our own staff around talking about this, how we're dealing and coping with COVID-19 and how to COVID-19, and then how do we become allies? And so Laura Lee is my director. I'm the program director, and then Allie Braswell is in Florida, guiding our work there. We don't need to necessarily go over these things. This is kind of our statement that all of for the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, Mayo Clinic will be recognized by patients and employees and peer institutions and the community as a leading model for diversity and inclusion. And that's kind of how we go about doing that in that circle. But for our conversation, this is kind of where we've started conversations about how to deal with this. So as we work to control the spread of COVID-19, we must also control the spread of hate during this pandemic. And what we've recognized is that there's been a lot of scapegoating that has happened towards our Asian American colleagues, both inside and outside of spheres that we control. What we've noticed is that this has been something that's been ramping up, that's been accumulating, and we even, we hear it from some of the highest political offices that, this particular disease should be associated with a particular country or a particular group of people, when we know that this is a human disease, right? And so have you seen any of these types of incidences in your local community, and how have people addressed them or make comments about them? So I'm curious to hear what you've experienced.
I'll jump in. I live in a city outside of Chicago. It's a suburb. We're about 40 minutes outside, so predominantly white. But we do have some, some diversity here, just not as much as in a lot of the communities that surround us. And there was a Chinese American doctor, physician, who was out running on a trail and who was attacked while he was running on the trail and verbally assaulted, and they threw things at him. Again, some in line with some of the things that are on the screen here. So very unfortunate. And then just the community response to on the, if you read through the comments on the article that was written up about it, really disappointing to see a lot of this. Lots of allies, but lots of people that are, not helping the conversation, I think.
Yeah. Other folks, I'll give a couple more minutes. Okay, cool. We'll move on. And so this doesn't seem to be an anomaly, particularly in the United States, right? During the AIDS epidemic, who did we blame for those things?
The LGBTQ.
Yeah, right. So when MERS happened and when the so-called swine flu, we look for scapegoats. And why do we look for scapegoats?
I think it's easier to have someone to put that blame on to make us feel better about ourselves. I think that being able to place that, even though it's misplaced or not, but being able to place it somewhere, kind of put it in a box, if you will, helps us cope better, I think.
Yeah. Other folks, what do you think? Why do we need a scapegoat?
I definitely think that's about right. We as humans want to make sense of things, and in the case of something so senseless as a pandemic that's, unpredictable and scary, it's easy for us to find something very controllable that we can get scared or angry about.
Yeah. We have to have something that we can see, right? And we have to for whatever, for our psychology, we can't terms, but if we can manifest to something, we can, right, wrong, or otherwise. But I think that's part of the psychology of where we are, right? And so there become these three pieces that we should consider, particularly when we're engaging in this conversation, and that's fear, stigma, and ethnocentrism, right? And so, so what do you think is at the root of fear? Is at the root of fear?
Understanding, or the perspective of their understanding.
So
you just don't know enough, you don't know about the other enough that you're fearful of it.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
I would agree with that. I would say unknown, not lack of understanding, all that kind of, anything that we don't understand or know about, we tend to fear.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say that too, different, right?
Yeah.
Different, yeah, that's a good word. Different is good.
Yeah, and I would go as far as to say that even that the root of fear may not necessarily be the fear itself, but it's the ambiguity that produces fear, right? So when I'm not sure about a thing, when I don't know about a thing, when I'm not, then that psychological that psychological mechanism of ambiguity produces this fear, right? So the less more we can reduce fear, right? But we also know that stigma is related to fear because it gives us this so-called enemy to engage with, right? So so let's talk a little bit about those two things, and then we'll get into some other stuff. So sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Anyone ever heard that?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, right? What do we know about that?
words do hurt.
That is
Yeah, they hurt. Yeah,
It's
that somebody said that's BS. Yeah, no, it. Go ahead.
We were raised that way. You know, we all grew up learning that and kind of that, you know, that biased opinion. But the truth of the matter is, words hurt.
Yeah.
You pretend as adults. The truth is, in your quiet time, when you're washing dishes or figuring out what you're going to eat for dinner, you're going to think back to what that person said in that meeting, how burned up you were.
That's true. Right? I mean, there are something, and you know, and I'm sure we figured this out, that there are some things that we should never say because we can't take them back. Right? You know, so yeah, sticks and stones, that was a great thing to kind of try to build resilience, but it wasn't very accurate, right? And so stigma is really this set of unfair beliefs that are typically perpetrated by the uninformed or the having a little bit of knowledge about a thing, right? And it is projected onto something or someone. And so when we think about this fear, there are a number of different kinds of fears, but the one we want to speak specifically to is this xenophobia, this fear of the other. And again, going back to my previous statement, I think this so-called fear is actually a response to ambiguity, like not knowing what is going to happen. So we fill in the gaps. We create the pictures ourselves. And so when we think about ethnocentrism, what do you see is happening in this particular diagram, where the person is looking at this image on the floor, and one person sees a 6 and the other person sees a 9? How does this relate to ethnocentrism?
It's from their point of view. Yeah. Perception.
So perception, people seeing things from their point of view?
It's not that they're coming at this from like a bad faith place or like lying. It's just that they're seeing what they see. It's very different than what someone else sees.
Yeah. So what
their experiences.
So their experiences. Okay?
And their assumption that those experiences equal correctness somehow.
Not only correctness, but rightness, right? So not only is it correct, it's also right, which anything that is not is wrong. Start to add moral judgments to those things. And so when I look at this image in this picture, it really strikes me to ask some deeper questions. So how did one person get to learn that it is a 6 and the other person learned that it was a 9? How did they come to that? What are some methods? The
culture.
So the culture that they grew up in?
Experiences. I still think that's a part of it.
So their personal experiences and influences. All right. How else?
You know, their role models in life, like who they looked up to, who they obtained advice from along the years.
Yeah. Yeah. So I know for me, there are ways that I see today, and I think I alluded to it a little bit earlier, that are directly impacted by my parents, right? By the people who taught me, people who helped raise me. And so I would say that these individuals are very much in that same mold, right? Has anyone ever received a copy of a copy of a copy? Anyone? Can you just say?
What do you mean?
You make a copy. So when I was in college.
Oh, okay, got it.
Right.
It's all fragmented.
Yeah, it gets blurry. It's fragmented. It's bad. And that copy that you've received does not look like the original, right? Like in the textbook, it looks really good in the textbook, but after you've copied your copy, it looks so good. And I would say the same thing happens for us. So as people have given us their worldview, where did they get their worldview from?
Yeah, I mean, just where they happen to be standing, right? So just like these people, they showed up, they happen to be standing at opposite ends. You don't where you were, what you were born into, and what culture and all of that shapes what you're seeing. I love this image of you where you're seeing something different.
You're right, right. And so, the people who have told them that this is people that have told them this was a 9, where did they get their information from? Probably from other 6, and that this is a 9. Where did those people get information? Probably from others. And so one of the things we have to recognize is that we don't see the world as it is. We see where does change have to start? I'm talking about the man.
Right. Please mute his mic.
So at any rate, so how do we think, how we see the world, how we see ourselves? For really kind of trying to balance that stuff out. Find in like the intercultural development, I think it's a great tool. I prefer this. So I also believe that we're not on or off a bad thing. If I talk too little, that I have to find the behavior that was a second. And which is my ethnicity or my relative that I can compare my chart. So homogeneous cultures, means groups, means that monocultural groups, cultures where differences along the continuum integration goals, right? Do want to recognize in a poor we've done it effectively in our social systems. What is integration?
My generation was essentially, there was a program, and I came from a suburb of Milwaukee. One of the things that occurred, a program called, I think it was the 220 program, the suburban high schools, who is not white. It was now a lot of the things that I learned. I'm still really good friends with a lot of, like there's two different worlds, even when I where did, because that you were a part. There are almost 30 years gone by. I hate to use this term, but the quote unquote terrible even that I say it that way right now. Where they were.
Right.
Where let me step back. One of the things I think that was amazing out of each other. I mean, we didn't have, but I don't remember you weren't seeing terms against each other.
Mm-hmm.
Learn to get along.
Yeah.
But I think I'm not living my life how to get along as a society.
My family, I'm African American. That was a weird thing for a family of color to do. Quite a bit. They thought that my child was a chapter 2. So those things that were prevalent, 20 students are treated different than other students, where they just don't have access to that same level of. And then I'm looking at it from, wait, what's going on in the Detroit area? Were predominantly big shift for me when communities that felt like those communities that were left behind. People in leadership didn't look like.
There's some imagery, right? So this is integration. So what's the problem with that model that I just presented? Interlock with these. What's the challenge with that?
You're trying to add to instead of making an entirely new condition.
I'm still in the same vein, so I don't want you to think that people say that I think it's a bunch of malarkey when they say, what's the pinnacle of conflict resolution? What answer you, Andre? Because
that you're both giving something up.
That you're
value.
Of what kind of value? So we're something of equal value, but what happens when one of the parties
feel like you didn't give up as much as they did?
Resentment is a seed of resentment, right? So Andre, if you're not saying if you we should be looking at integration. Yeah. And we end up with situations like, how is it that Madison has 66? How do you let that kind of thing happen, right? So third way of being, right? You have to, and that's how we've treated integration. So integration is this because I want to hear your thoughts about how to have light on it, and we can move forward to Star Trek: The Next Generation. One of my favorite shows. There was war-torn planet, and so the planet could leap to other planets and so forth and so on. So he was also a telepath, and so he had a and so he goes to do now. The Federation's like, we're going to pull this guy. This is not a safe situation. Let the planet destroy itself, and we're going to figure it out. And so one of the things that you and I, they looked exactly the same, but to each other, I know how to fix this. And it's third, they had a way to communicate with him. He talks about this in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. If your oppressor fears most is being the liberation for the the top and bottom, and they keep circulating these things. Way of being. So how do we get rid of all of these things? First, we must back up. That's what we've been using as a tool to kind of talk, because when we address, if we stay true to our right, I have my principles. At Mayo, we say we have to stay connected to. So there's that. And so think about, so be a sponsor for someone away. But how many times, or what does it, thoughts, observations? Yeah.
I think that one right there. At the same individual blue-colored box in that spectrum, if you want to call it that, we're speaking about.
Correct. And place. I think, so part of the conclusion that you have just come to, that you can be in a number of shame and blame that I do, or feeling that I'm in one of these places, so, being 5 years old is not bad. Being 50 years old is not bad. Another thought about that?
I've been looking at it, and the generational differences, different world than where we are today. And my mom, who's my only remaining parent left, a result of the kids have brought forward, limitations are. There are, and I just don't know if they're able to comprehend it even. So it's a matter of, can you move the ball when you have it, so to speak?
So this is Connie. A thought, but it was coming to me. You're in this space. This is how you. That's where you are. You're in development. Like that's your development. If you're at answer to that, what is the interrupter? How do you?
He's dancing again.
Want to?
Can I? And I don't know if I've shared this with anybody on it. So when I was Bible thumping all over the place, there was like a program that would support your students. Friday came, everybody's wearing jeans. At that time, I was at a understand. I was like, why would they just come sideways? And all probably 4 months later, I was pregnant, and it was my interrupter. A part of me and a part of people that I had to see it, and it wasn't because I didn't want to see it. That interrupted me personally to be, even though I didn't realize it when I was.
It were right. So that's what I think about, is that it's the goal, and I don't make apologies, but bigots, racist. They're allowed to be things, right? Because they're a social penalty. If a person, nothing I can say to them that will. However, if we're able to, do you command fish to jump into your boat? And it will get on the hook, and you can catch a person who's at level 2. They're looking at our goals differently when we start recognizing, and the wider that gap, the more identity, but thought, the more behaviors are in my goals. It's not where you I mean, right? What you do with the time that you.
From a diversity.
Can I just pop in once off? Don't feel bad about it. If Andre,
we're trying to make this become diverse. We had our focus groups that we just had. We just got over that. You could see the way they understand based on different African American or some other group. We could see all of that, right? Trying to put forth in this group, knowing that people are going, they are, right? How we're trying to come up with something that they don't necessarily want.
I got to do what Mayo Clinic. And it's funny. I had a supervisor once who, supervisor, I don't want to do this. You're coming from, but I just want to let you know.
Right.
And I said, you know what? So I mean, so there's certain types we're going, and if you can't, don't want to, don't take that stance. I'll just give you a little bit of behind the curtain at Mayo Clinic, even in because they love it. But I told them, I said when I first got old furniture, anybody have grandmothers or grandfathers stuff, and it's not comfortable.
Right.
It would get back to your point. Successful, and this is how we're going to move. It's time to take off the plastic off the furniture, so we can get real about. But that's that's something. Yeah.
Advice, right, for us as something that raised, right? That's something that's very common in even my family. Gonna flip on me, and I don't. Sorry, that's my 2-year-old.
We know what's going. We know what.
If I vitality, right? And so how do we, I worry even as we do the diversity and inclusion initiatives in standing, but I think nobody's ever asked, hey, you need to move, right? It was Sean that made the point, right? Yeah. But how do we suffer? You are just allowing people to come stand.
Yes. So first of all, right? So you'll hear people say, "Goo for you." What's the purpose of a doormat? To be walked on, so that what on that mat, so that when you go into the so doormats have a reason. Okay, right? The other thing is be effective. My intimate partner relationships in my early, what do you think being right costs me? Ultimately, my relationships. Yeah, those. And so the question is to give up stuff because it's like really having a hard time with diversity because of the minority. I'm being diminished. They're taking stuff from me.
Well, why does it matter? Like, that's what it's amazing.
Yeah, that brings up an interesting point. Like, oh no,
And that's what Paulo Freire is talking about, right? It's me, the way I treated them. That ambiguity keeps people your behaviors, allowing you to achieve your. But if they're not, then we can behaviors that are congruent with not that. That's what I would suggest.
All right. So for the sake of Andre, I want to thank you so much for. I was glad that you led us where you led us.
Thank you so much, Andre.
Thank you.
You are so welcome.
If you were.
Thank you. Thank you. So,
Please.
yeah.
All right, you too.
Thank you.
Bye.